All right, let's get going. So welcome everyone. Welcome to November's Science Gateways Community Institute webinar. Today we will have a rollicking good time learning about accessibility, but just a few notes before we get started. So do keep your audio and video muted for this until we get to the question and answer, which will be at the end. That's just so that we don't have any extra clutter and noise because we are recording this for later use and posting on our website, and that will simplify any extraneous noise as well as visual video and so forth. So you can also submit chat questions at any time, and I will keep an eye on those. If it's something clarification-wise that I can answer, I'll do that. But otherwise, we're going to be holding questions until the end during the Q&A. And as I mentioned, also the slides and recording are posted on our website. We also, and maybe Claire can pop this into chat, our webinar page has a PDF of a handout that Hiram has prepared today that you can download and use to take notes with. So if you follow that link that Claire just popped into the chat, you can grab that PDF to follow along with. So I just want to tell you a little bit about SGCI. I recognize lots of the names here, so I'll try to keep it short. But we like to let you know what else we do besides webinars. So we're here, we're funded by the National Science Foundation to provide support to gateways in 3 main ways. And the first area is through the support for building and running gateways. And that includes hands-on development support, consultant support, and also a catalog. So if you have a gateway and you're not already in the catalog, I would encourage you to list it there. It's a way for other projects to see examples of gateways that they might want to copy in terms of ideas, but it's also a way for users to find you. And there's also a collection of software in there that are tools that you can use to build gateways. Our second main area is through our various education and training programs, such as this webinar series, but also the Focus Week, which if you saw on the first slide, applications can be made through the 23rd of November for this one, which is going to be virtual. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to apply soon. We also have a number of student-focused programs, including internships, and of course our website has a bunch of materials on it. And then finally, we're here to create a community through various ways of networking and connecting with each other. The annual conference, which is completed, is one way of doing that. Also, we have a Google group that is a forum for people to post ideas to each other, questions and so forth, and it's a good way to get specific questions answered. We have 2 ambassadors programs. One is what we call the Gateways Ambassadors, which is people who support gateways and would like to be able to connect with other people who do similar things, such as like in research computing and so forth. And then we also have a Science Ambassadors program, which is for people who would like to promote their gateway and the concept of gateways more broadly within the scientific community. And that includes money. So go to our website to learn about that. We also have a partner and affiliates program, which allows additional benefits for promoting your software and so forth. So that's kind of us in a nutshell. I just want to also encourage you at the end to give us your feedback. We do collect this feedback and use it to come up with ideas for future sessions. So please do put your information, your comments there. It's a really short evaluation, about 30 seconds, and it includes a slot for you to say topics that you're interested in hearing. So with that, I am going to hand this off to Hiram Kuykendall, who is an expert on accessibility. He is at Microassist, which helps organizations that have, particularly those who realize that, oops, we should be accessible, to do so. He co-presented at the conference last month, and I think you'll find this to be lots of fun. So I'll let Hiram take it away.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Catherine. So I've had lots of conversations about accessibility with a wide number of people. And some of the most interesting ones are people that are in the open source or freeware community. And by that, I mean they have a product and they basically are giving it away for free. And the things that I have the biggest challenges is convincing them that making their products accessible for people with disabilities is a requirement. Another challenge I have is that it is possible to make a web-based product that is accessible. So in this overly ambitious presentation, I'll start with building an understanding of the accessibility requirements from a open source perspective. I'm going to call it open source rather than gateway. That way, if I say something mean, it's not directly tied to you. Start with building an understanding of accessibility requirements, and then what an organization is going to ask for as proof of accessibility. And we're going to use a voluntary product accessibility template kind of as a guide for that. So let's move on. So there's nothing more boring than an accessibility presentation. Everybody, you're already probably brought pillows to the meetup. But so what I'm going to do is, as I go through here, we're going to kind of make a mind map or a vision board of what your requirements are, because you have all this information, but making coherent sense out of it is really kind of difficult. So let's start off with the most basic aspects. Society has laws. We have created laws that that specifically apply to people with disabilities. And the two that are going to be most applicable to this presentation is the Rehabilitation Act 1973, Americans Disability Act, and the Americans Disability Act. Now, don't hang up. We're not going to go too much into the law because I know that's the boring end of it. But let's start with one observation. When I talk to people who do software development, especially for universities, I ask them, they're like, well, these laws, were they kind of technical laws? And I'm like, no, these are not technical laws. These are civil rights laws. So these are the same same category of laws that we get that govern race and sex discrimination. So they're in the same category. Matter of fact, if you look at the definition of civil rights laws, civil rights laws guarantee the rights of individuals to receive equal treatment and prohibits discrimination in a number of settings, including education, employment, housing, lending, voting, and more. So that's just something I grabbed off fine law. It sounds like a fine thing to have. So, and I'm not going to go too deep on that. I'm just going to stop right there that these are civil rights laws. And I'm only going to pick on one of them initially, the one that I think is probably more applicable to you and your students and the people that you serve, and that's Section 504. Now, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, specifically says discrimination against people with disabilities in programs that receive federal financial assistance. So it's aimed at so for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to define Section 504. If you take $1 of federal money, what you have to produce has to be accessible, no exceptions. And there's some really good examples of this that I can send out. There's one from MIT where they produced a MOOC, a massive online system, and it was not accessible. They took federal funds, and the government came back and they said, "Hey, this is not accessible," and they said, well, that wasn't a requirement. They tried to get out of it. And long story short is they had to go in and at their own expense, they had to remediate their products. But for the purposes of this conversation, because we're kind of keeping this high level, is that a university is subject to 504, and that while you as a gateway producer may or may not be directly subject, your customer is. Matter of fact, let's start our vision board. So what I said was there's the open source community who's developing something. There's their customers, which is the university and their obligations. We said there's a thing called Section 504, which is a federal law, a civil rights law. It says if you take $1, you have to make your stuff accessible. No exceptions. There are no exceptions to this. So that's interesting, but I really didn't talk about, maybe a gateway producer. I didn't necessarily talk about somebody who's creating open source software. That's the university's obligation. That's not necessarily yours. except under one condition. If you take dirty federal money through grants or something like that, you've inherited that obligation. And just because you may not have planned for accessibility, it may not have been in your grant to do something that's to check for accessibility, but the obligation follows you anyway. And I can send a whole list of programs that have taken federal money and then come back and had bad experiences. MIT and Harvard being the two most famous of those. And as you can see on the screen, that's a grant that's no longer supported. That's a Kerry grant, but he's no longer available. So that kind of gets us through our first hurdle. So now, all right, here's where I'm going to try to prove to the group that we have what we need to create an accessible product. And based on questions I got at the Gateway Plenum, I think it's good to kind of go through and take maybe a closer look at the history of accessibility. So, okay, the earth cooled, there were dinosaurs, they went away, we got computers. So let's start there. In 1999, we got two things that were our first real attempts at getting accessibility into the mainstream. We got the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 1.0, and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are a set of guidelines used by developers to make experiences that are accessible. Okay. And we got really the HTML 4.10 specifications. So the federal government has been tracking this whole time, trying to figure out, well, we're trying to buy products and they're web-based. How do we know if they're accessible or not? And so the private industry ran up and said, hey, we know how to do this. So big people, these big companies came in and they created a consortium, the Information and Technology Council, and they created the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. Now, the goal of this is for a vendor who is selling to federal government to come in and be able to self-report on web-based software, non-web-based software, video, hardware, your telephone systems, your copiers, everything, and then documentation and support. Because the federal government, they're very clever, those guys, and they realize that it's not only the product, but the support that goes with it also has to be accessible. And I'll be honest with you, yeah, they were pretty horrible. It was version 1.0. It was hard to understand. The guidelines were not very good. And what staved off a lot of the lawsuits was anytime somebody tried to raise an objection, you simply went in and said, you can't really truly make an accessible application. And there was enough people that said that it was true. If the majority of people believe it, it must be true. So then, behold, in 2008, we get a rewrite. We get the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.0. Now, this is kind of a game changer for us in the industry. The WCAG is a set of principles. So rather than being prescriptive, like thou shalt put a button on the page, it became more guidelines on how to do it. So this is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And this is and it's broken up into success criteria. Now, we're not going to go super deep in this, but success criteria tell you at a high level what they're expecting. So in this case, they say non-text content that is present to the user has alternative text that serves equivalent purpose except for the situations listed below. What they're saying is if you have an image, you have an image on the screen, a person who is blind and using assistive technology does not know what that image is, you need to put alternate text on it, right, to make it perceivable. So why didn't they just say that? That's because this is a principle. It now is applied to Word documents and PDFs and web pages. And so by keeping it at the principle level, it became a much better standard, much harder to understand, but a standard that's going to have much more longevity, and it's going to apply to more than just web-based technologies. So we got the 2.0, and then something magical happened. And for those of you in the room that are developers, this is the 2 to write down. 2014, we got HTML5 and we got something called WAY ARIA. Now, HTML5 is the language of the internet. I'm going to make that bold statement there. So web pages are basically created out of HTML. Not always, but 99.9% of the time, it's HTML5. Well, even in 2014, and by the way, it's 2014 when HTML5 became a recommendation. So that's a key event at the W3C. When something reaches a recommended status, that means it's not in beta, it's not in alpha. This is it. We got it baked. You can now use this thing. HTML5 had gaps. So all the time, there was another working group at the W3C, and they created this thing called WAY ARIA, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And it's kind of like the peanut butter. So in HTML5, there are accessibility gaps, and you come in, you can use ARIA to fill those gaps. You know, for example, if there's a button on the screen and I click the button and it has a up and down state, HTML5 has no way of saying, hey, I'm pushed or I'm not pushed. That's where ARIA would come in. So the point is not so much what it is. The point is we now have standards, a complete set of standards that that can be used to create accessible web applications and mobile applications and Word documents and PDF documents. And you say, Hiram, I don't believe you. Prove that. How do I know that these standards are actually baked enough that I can do it? Because I got a few questions at the last thing that I don't think I have your hearts and minds yet. I don't know if you truly believe you can make an accessible web application. So let's let the market do the talking for us. So we track OCR and Title III Title III lawsuits. Title III are the ones you hear about. These are the ones that are filed in court and have demand letters, and it's the big mess that's going on in New York and Florida and California. And before HTML5 and WAY ARIA became a recommended standard, there were very few Title III lawsuits. We were sitting here at nothing. We had one little blip in 2013 because they were starting to catch on. Hey, this means we have a complete standard. Since then, we've had a few lawsuits like Winn-Dixie, to name a few. And Winn-Dixie came in and the prosecution said, hey, you can make web applications accessible. And they brought in the defendant and they asked the defendant's expert, can you make accessible web applications? And the guy was like, yeah. And once they did that, it was just like pulling the cork out of the bottle. If I can't prove to you through showing you code, maybe I can prove to you through looking at the environment that you can make accessible web applications. And that is where the bar is now. So the next big event to happen in 2017, we got VPAT 2.0. So HTML5 was out, ARIA is out, the WCAG is out. We had what we need. They completely revamped the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. So now when you fill out a Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, is now called an Accessibility Conformance Report, and they have put that they have used the WCAG and Section 508. And created a much better attestation that purchasers can use to figure out how accessible your product is. And then in 2018 was the last big event. WCAG 2.1 came out because we had a gap. Back in 2008, mobile applications were not a thing. And so all along this time, they're trying to figure out how do we judge mobile apps. And so in 2018, they did a .1 upgrade to the WCAG, and they added some stuff in there for mobile. And there were other things, non-text contrast. There's some other fun stuff in there. So let's try to update our diagram and try to figure out, oh my gosh, what's your obligation? Why should we care about this? So I told you the Section 508 is out there, and so you're like going, I'm not subject to Section 508, even if I'm part of a university. Maybe I'm a private university. I'm not directly related to Section 508. No, but Section 508 gave us a very big tool. It gave us a VPAT, a Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. And that VPAT directly hooked itself onto the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So the VPAT doesn't directly hook to the web, but it's hooked to the guidelines. and then you're creating your tools out of HTML5 and ARIA, and you're making iOS and Android apps, and you're doing all those wonderful things. Okay, so universities, and realize we're going over a large span of time, and universities are at different parts of the timeline. But universities realized that they had a gap, right? So they're buying these products and they're getting these Office of Civil Rights complaints under Section 504. It's just part of the Department of Justice. And they said, look, I am tired of getting OCR complaints. And every university got one, because there was at least one person going around to every university checking your website and then filing an OCR complaint. So I know I would take the bet that you've got an OCR complaint related to digital accessibility, not physical, related to digital accessibility. So the university said, okay, we need to update. So they created accessibility policies. And in fact, most universities I work with have an accessibility policy. I'm working with, I think, the last one in the universe that doesn't have an accessibility policy. And the accessibility policy said things like, okay, our guideline is going to be WCAG 2.0 or WCAG 2.1. And from that, it affected the purchasing policy. The other thing that universities did is they say, when you're buying software, I want to get a VPAT from the vendor. Now, if you have open source software, guess what? You're not selling to a university. So the university is never going to take you through the purchasing process. What's going to happen is the college or department's going to want to use your software. What do? They just use it. They go out and they get it, they bring it in-house. And until very recently, most universities had really no process to evaluate or require the evaluation of using open source software. But that's changed. Okay, so kind of the brief history of time again. We got a gap. You're not directly tied to the university's obligation until recently. Several things have happened. So one I mentioned. So there are policy changes. So Section 508 is actually very good. It says, yeah, if you procure it, you build it, you maintain it. Okay. So in other words, build it, buy it. If you have it in-house, you have to make sure that it's accessible. So universities have adopted that stance. Now, not universally, but most of them have adopted that stance through policy and it'll say something like, we support WCAG 2.1. It applies to faculty, staff, and contractors, and anybody who walks on campus. And, so it goes on and on and on, their accessibility policy. And that was a result of, to a large degree, I am going to kind of give OCR a little bit of credit here. We had a lot of universities that came to work with us because they had an OCR complaint, and that was part of it. OCR says, go find yourself an accessibility company and bring them on board. So that's part of it. But now the other thing, which I think is the bigger thing, and so those two are sticks, right? So those are sticks. We don't like sticks. I'd rather just do carrots than sticks. I have listened to a lot of talk about gateways. I did the Palladium, and then worked with Catherine, and then we're doing an audit. And the one thing that comes up is being inclusive. Just as I don't think you would ever say, we're making software that we want to exclude minorities, or we want to exclude women. I don't think you want to exclude people with disabilities. I think you're looking to bring people on. So I think the most compelling reason that accessibility is getting into the open source software market is that you're there for an altruistic purpose, and you want to include the most people possible. And then the last one, so there's two big ones I think that drove us forward. It's OCR, I'm going to give them credit, but then COVID has changed the university landscape dramatically, where before we did not necessarily have to think about our digital environment. Suddenly it's been thrust in our face in a way that we're not seeing. So what I'm seeing on the universities that I'm dealing with is that the back door for just bringing in software and not having it evaluated is being snipped, and that through the accessibility policy, you're going to be put through the same paces that you would have as if you were selling to a university. So kind of brief history of time there. So what I want to do now is I want to go deeper on the voluntary product accessibility template. And I want to start talking about if I was a purchaser, let's pretend like you're selling me software. If I was a purchaser, what would I be looking for in your attestation? Because you're going to have to turn this around and say, our product, it needs to do these things, need to be tested in these ways. Okay. So the first thing we're going to pick on is evaluation methods used. Knowledgeable purchasers have been taught to look for two things in this field. One is automated and manual testing. So automated testing is kind of what you may be used to. It's like using Wave or Axe or IBM Equal Access Checker or any of the million tools out there. You push a button, it comes back, it gives you a thumbs up, thumbs down. Well, the problem is those tools can only catch 30 to 40% of errors. I'll give you a good example. Let's just stop there. If I get off on the examples, I'll run over time. So let's just assume for a moment that that's true, that you can only catch 30 to 40% of the errors. So where do the other 60 some odd errors, how are they caught? They're caught through manual testing. They're caught by using screen readers and doing testing of complex objects. They're through techniques like having a skip to main at the top of your page. And that you actually use the same tools that a person with a disability would use. So you may use JAWS or NVDA or VoiceOver or TalkBack, or Zoom text, or there's a lot of tools out there. Now that's a big conversation on which tools do you need to use, and so I'd love to come back and talk about that some other time in a very technical conversation. But you have to be aware of that. If you're saying to yourself, well, we don't even do automated testing, you need to consider this. You need to think about how am I gonna present this to my user. And I believe the next top up I was talking to Catherine is on how do you market your gateway to other people's. I'm assuming universities. Well, they're likely going to start ask these questions. How are you testing for accessibility? And you're going to need to have a response to that. The next thing that a VPAT has, so once again, I'm not making this up. This is the attestation you would have to give a university if you were selling to them. Is you have to pick your standards and guidelines. And I get a lot of questions on, well, what standard should I use? Now, it's a little less of a conversation in universities. Somebody figured it out. Somebody put it in their policy. I will give you the most general of guidelines. Higher education, in the higher education space, it varies. But in general, private universities seem to be adopting WCAG 2.1 level A. My public universities seem to be adopting WCAG 2.0 level A. And I can tell you the difference. So the private universities are thinking very hard about what do our students use when they come on campus. They're using mobile phones. They're using less tablets, mostly mobile phones. And they said, that is so important to us, we will adopt a higher standard so we can check and see if the mobile device, if it's behaving properly on a mobile device. And that would, and there's lots of people out there, George Washington University, Syracuse, Harvard. I mean, all of them have adopted a 2.1 stance, and I could go on and on. But people that step to 2.0 that are in the university space, University of Texas, University of California, and the reason, let's just pick on Texas for a minute because that's where I'm from. University of Texas public school is tied to Texas Administrative Code 206 and 213. There's something you don't care about. And it is directly tied to Section 508. Section 508, as we see below, Section 508 by reference adopts WCAG 2.0 level AA. So that actually comes into play. You'll find out there are multiple versions of a VPAT template. There's a 508 version, there's a WCAG version. I really didn't have time to go into all those, but the 508 version will only have WCAG 2.0 because that's the way the law reads, and it's not. I don't know if it's going to change anytime soon, but universities are being progressive and they're saying no, that's not good enough. We need to get up to that higher standard. Let me just do a quick time check here. I think we're. Oh my gosh, we're doing amazingly well. I may be talking too fast. Okay, so let's talk about, so we just got through with the first part of the VPAT. So now let's go into a little deeper. So when we get into the second part of the VPAT, we actually get into the WCAG, section. And to bring up, to show you what it looks like, and I'll put this in the chat, there's always an easy way to find the VPAT. If you type VPAT download, it'll bring up a lot of things, but eventually you'll see out here the iti.org. And if you select that, and I will put this in the chat window, at least I think I'll put this in the chat window. Let's see, can I find chat? Chat. Why?
It's in the 3-dot menu. There you go. You got it.
There we go. I found it. So you'll find the VPAT. And then down here, you'll find there's an international version, a 508 version, a WCAG version, and a European edition. The difference between the two is the 508. I'll download 2 of these, and I'll very briefly show them to you. I have no idea what it was griping about. So here's the 508 edition. There is 500 pages. There's 9 pages of instructions. I'm sorry, I'll just have to scroll through these, and you'll just have to painfully watch as I go through them. Please look away. Everybody wants to fall out of their seat during a presentation. So here's the first part, which we just kind of went over, which is the evaluation method used in our standards and guidelines. And then we get down here to the WCAG report. And so literally the web content accessibility guidelines are laid out in sequential order. There's 3 levels of the WCAG guidelines. There's level A, and here's all the level A principles. There's the double A. Trust me, there was double A. There's triple A. And then because this is the 508, we actually get into the section 508 specific reporting, which there's things in here like hardware, software, and then software and non-web software. And then there's the actual support documentation services. So if you were to look at the WCAG version, it's going to look very similar, although it did not open. Where'd it go? Well, I'll just open it again. The WCAG version is going to look very similar. Whoops. Once again, I apologize for scrolling down so fast. Everybody loves to come to a presentation and I make you dizzy going through it. Once again, the top is the same, but there's, instead of 2.0, there's 2.0 and 2.1. And then when we get to the report section, they don't have all of those things laid out. They just want you to report on just the product. So this version would not be good for doing hardware or reporting on documentation and supplemental services. So let's get back to the presentation though. So we're going to go ahead and look at 508 because I think it's the most comprehensive, right? So when we come in here and we talk about WCAG, they say, okay, you need to report on web, electronic document, software, closed, authoring tools. And you're like, what in the world is all that? Web is probably your main web-based product. So in this case, it would be your gateway. You would come in here and your attestation would be on the web section. Electronic documents, if you're doing 508, they're smart. They're going to say, I'm concerned more than just your individual product. If you're giving me training, if you're giving me documentation, if you're giving me something that I'm going to pass out to my users, my customers, I need you to have an attestation to that. So you're actually going to do 2 of those. Software is for non-web software. So if it's a desktop product, you would just report it there. And then closed captions are like kiosks. So basically, if I, as an accessibility, if I need a screen reader, so I'm a person with a vision disability, if I walk up and I can't put my software on it, that's a closed system. A calculator is a closed system. I can't add anything to it. And authoring tools is a little strange. We'll save authoring tools for another timeline. But here is the important point, and the reason I drug you into here. The difference. So when you're attesting to your product, you are either going to say it supports, it partially supports, it does not support, is not applicable, not evaluated. And I want to talk to you about supports. There is a difference between compliance and usability. Okay. So when you're doing a VPAT, when you're doing an attestation, you're really talking about compliance. And compliance, and this is the definition out of the VPAT, supports the function of the product has at least one method that meets the criterion without known defects or meets equivalent facilitation. Now, what does that mean? So imagine that you have a web application, you push a button and it doesn't work. All right, so it's going to download a graph for you, right? So you push the button, it doesn't work, but you can go through the menus and you can click and you can get it another way. You have another means. That is an instance that you might still have a supports, because there's two ways to do it. One way is inaccessible, one way is not accessible. So equivalent facilitation is a little trickier. So let me do an example for you. So let's say that we have a graph, and graphs are tough, right? So it's just a picture of a graph. And what you cannot do for the picture of a graph is take all of the data that makes up the graph and put it as alternate text behind the graph. You will get in trouble for that. We will find you if you do that. So, but now, according to the definition, that inaccessible graph could have two means of being made accessible. One is you could have an export the data, and most of you have that. I mean, that's a good thing, right? And so it kicks out a CVS file, an Excel file, a Word file, and it has all the data ground down. So that's one method. So that's one method in addition to having it on the screen. But now equivalent facilitation says, okay, it can be equal to or better than. So let's say you have the graph, you click a button and you get an SVG, a scalar vector graphic. So inside these new versions of graphics, you can go in and you can have all the points perceivable to a screen reader user. So when I enter the graph, I will be able to move from column to column. I will be able to hear the percentages. I'll be able to do that. So that would be an instance that you provided something that's even superior. So the important thing though is when you go through here, the minimal bar that's set is that you need to have at least one method for doing everything. Now, between you and me, we believe in having one interface to rule them all, right? So we don't really want to do multiple interfaces. We want one. But I wanted to point out that in the compliance world, we just need to make sure that we have one method for doing it, or something that's better. So the next column that we go to, that we need to kind of pull out your requirements, is the remarks and explanations. So remarks and explanations get to be a little bit tricky. So I actually pulled out of the instructions what you're supposed to put in the remarks and explanations. So if you say for non-text content, we support for web, you need to put something in the supports column. It may be all of our graphics used in our application have alternate text and are perceivable and usable by people with disabilities, or something like that. So they actually want you to say something. So just reading the instructions. Detailed remarks should be provided in the remarks and explanation column to justify your answer in the conformance level column. When the conformance level is partially supports or does not support, the remark should be identified, the functions and features with issues, how they do not fully support. Then the next one is if the criterion does not supply, explain why. And the last one is if an accessible alternative is used, describe it. Now, imagine that you're a purchaser and you're getting this attestation. And the whole point of a VPAT is that a purchaser should not have to test your software, right? So back in 1999, that's kind of what was happening. We were like, well, if you're selling the federal government, they really cared about accessibility, they actually tested it. And that's too slow. The volume's too high. So what the VPAT does is it comes in and says, we have tested. And so for, in this case, non-text content, for web, we say we support it. And then let me tell you how we do it. And so, we'd say, we'd say, all the images have alternate text. But what if it's not? What if there is something that is lacking? So let's say some of the images on our application do not have alternate text. Well, purchasers look at this and they're going, oh man, you got a partially supports here. Does it really affect a person with disability? And so the question they're going to ask you is that. So what the instructions ask you to do is they want you to come over here. They want you to say, okay, images that were used as decorative, we forgot to put alternate text on, but all images that do something, that are part of buttons or they're part of links, all have alternate text. That's great, because then they can look at it and a purchaser can look at it and go, okay, I believe there's no impact of this failure. If an accessible alternative is used, we try very hard never to leave you with just, our images don't have alternate text and that's, that's it. So if there is an alternative, probably a better one than that is, let's say that we have a video player and it's not accessible. It doesn't have closed captioning facilities, right? So we say, under closed captioning, we say for web, we say, does not support. Video player doesn't have a closed captioning feature. But, so that's bad, because now you've left a purchaser with a hole. And what they have to do is they have to go to the requester. They have to say, this is the hole. Then the requester goes, oh my gosh, I have a hole. Well, I still want to use this software. So what they have to do is they have to go through an exception process. And that exception process is something happens in a university, it happens in any place that has an accessibility policy. That accessibility so to go through that exception process, they have to come in here and they have to document what is not working. If you have an accessible alternative, like our video player is not accessible, but you can use your own video player and we'll give you the videos and you can use them and you can do your own captions. That's frankly a horrible accessible alternative, but at least is an alternative. One, I can implement my own player in the solution. Two, I can take responsibility for doing the closed captioning. So that's a cost that I would incur. So if I have to go through the exception process, I can come in and I can fill it out. So the remarks and explanations, that's where you're going to talk about how you tested. It's where you're going to talk about what you found. That's where, if there's a defect, you're going to talk about how a customer can go around doing some kind of alternative means of getting it fixed. So your takeaway from that, kind of just rolling back here to the other side, is that evaluation method used, automated manual testing, you're going to have to pick your guideline. Then when you come in here, you're going to use these terms and terms: supports, partially supports, does not support, as your attestation. And then the remarks and explanation is going to be in the detail level, and your goal is never to leave your customer without a solution. If you have a gap, you really need to strive to provide them an alternative. Otherwise, they may not be able to use your solution. And the final part, and I just like to make this clear, because a lot of you are doing some really interesting things that, so the web content accessibility guidelines are really for digital experiences. They're for your web, they're for your mobile apps, they're for your LMSs, they're for those sort of things. But when you use the 508, it is much broader. So they actually do have hardware. So really what they were targeting is your phone systems, your fax machines, your kiosks. But if you do have a hardware component, just realize that you will be asked to to possibly report on the accessibility of it. And this is all kind of based on Section 508, and Section 508 is very good on hardware. Software, non-desktop software, we saw that it actually appears back up in the WCAG version. They do have some additional questions they want to ask you about non-tech software. And then Chapter 6 is the interesting one. So federal government, I've said it twice now, is very smart, and they know that a product is made up of more than just your product. It's also the support, the help desk, call centers, training, automated self-service technicians, all that stuff you may get asked to report on. So when you're thinking about your next project and the next thing you want to add, I really challenge you to look at this holistically. And when you're doing your budgets and you're applying for your grants, you need to think about accessibility, and you need to get them in there. You need to have your, when you're planning out your project, at what stages am I going to do accessibility? And that's the application development. I think probably the majority of the technical people on the call can kind of get their heads wrapped around, well, how is that going to work? I'm going to have sprints or whatever, and I'm going to have to do that. But the other elephant in the room that you may not be thinking of is that, is the community going to provide support for this? Now, with open source, it is what, it is what it is. Sometimes you have support, and sometimes it's more going into GitHub, right, and posting things. But certainly when you go into a university, especially a public university that follows Section 508, you're going to get questions on those things. Okay, well, wow, all right, I finished on the dot. So now what I'd like to do is, and I realize that there were a lot out there, I would love to hear any questions you have, and we can go back and revisit the topic and try to get some clarification.
We did get one question in from Mark Perry, and he said, what if you have a 3D graph that isn't really readable if you export it to Excel?
That's a tough one, and so a 3D graph is, so it's made up of, it's made up of something, right? It's made up of points. And, outside of, well, I understand what you're saying. You're saying that, it's working on multiple dimensions. I mean, the best thing that I can, if we had an example, I'm sure I can come up with something I can kind of halfway and visualize it. Oh, you know what? Okay, that's very interesting. So Mark had he answered his own question. Certainly when you're dealing with the blind community, one of the challenges they've had is envisioning math. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Braille is actually pretty horrendous at math. There's 2 versions of Braille, and they kind of support math differently. So what some schools that have the ability have been doing is they have been doing 3D printed renderings of things like a pie chart. What does 2/3 feel like? And you can actually get so they're printing 3D renderings of this thing. So a 3D printer, that would be incredible. I will come back to your presentation. I will help you write it. If you will take a 3D model and figure out how to do a 3D rendering of it for people with disabilities, that is a absolutely incredible thing, especially in the education space. So it's not unheard of. That's actually a very good observation. It's not unheard of. I've just never heard of anybody taking it to the 3D level.
Thanks. And just for those who are listening in the recording land, the follow-up question that Hiram just said was, is the option to export to a 3D printer an accessible option? So just so they know that. I have a question for you, Hiram, which
Sure.
is there's a lot of things here. What do people typically find the most thorny or, hard to, like it really sort of stops them in their tracks and makes them call you or whatever, just to like what sort of aspects of this are the most difficult to comply with?
I'll answer that. It's very easy, and it's planning. your project manager. So when you conceived of the project and you made your budget, and so let's assume for a minute that you're going out for a grant, or it doesn't have to be a grant. You're going to do it internally, right? You made your budget. Well, you put in enough money for developers, you put in enough money for QA time, you put a project manager in. Nobody adds in the specific cost to get developers either trained on accessibility, or even more fundamental than that, you didn't put testing slots in your sprints to test for accessibility. And so what happens is, because it did not get baked in at the conceptual level at the beginning, you don't have a budget. If you don't have a budget, your project manager is not going to get it. Your project manager is not going to even mention it to your developers. Developers wouldn't have the tools to use because they weren't even considered at the beginning. So what happens is, you get all the way to the end and you get your final product. And then somebody then asks about accessibility, and you're so far down the line that that coming back and fixing it is horrendous.
So there's a question, what are rough budgets for this, or are there tools for estimating that?
So you hear, so in the industry, we say, if you plan it at the beginning, it's about a 20% additional cost. And so, and we've all done our own little estimates. And so in the beginning, it's about a 20% bump. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, it takes you 20% longer. I don't know if I actually believe that, because here's the thing. Accessibility is baked into the standards. HTML5 and all this stuff has it in there. If you have programmers that were really, really top of the line programmers, they would already be doing things in an accessible manner. There would be some techniques they need to add to it. Now, here's the flip side of that. So let's say it's a 20% bump on a budget in the beginning. If you don't do it and get to the end, it's literally 100% to 150% cost to go back and retrofit everything. And that's because you have to go all the way back up. So the first thing that you probably did when you were doing your gateway, you said, what colors do you want it to use? Well, we love Brazil or Mexico, so let's use red, green, and white, right? So you selected your colors. And let's say that you picked colors that didn't really have good color contrast for foreground and background, and you have an accessibility problem. Well, you got all the way to the end, and somebody says, hey, these are not accessible colors. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is a very minor technical issue. We can go in the CSS and we can change those colors, but we had it approved by the chancellor, the provost, God, and all the angels in heaven have blessed this. You can ask me to change anything but that. And then you get more then you get into the more technical parts, which is if you had, let's say, a 3D a 3D model, and you're like, you didn't even consider, how do we do an accessible version of this? You didn't apply any thought to it. Well, now you've got to go back and you've got to have that original thinking. And now, by the way, Mark, that was really good with the 3D printer. I don't know if, as to whether that's a suitable accommodation, because I think that's probably a better example of the equivalent facilitation, that, you did something that is like beyond good, that there's a real technical aspect of that. But I mean, because he thought of that solution, when he put in his VPAT, he said, look, I have a 3D model, it's not accessible. So just saying that actually gave the university some, whoops. Are we about out of time? About ready to get kicked off?
No, it's just, we have 5 minutes, so I just want to make sure people see this before we're done.
Okay.
Yeah.
But what Mark said was really good, because he gave a solution, right? So now the university has something they can think about. Now they can say, well, that's not feasible for us, but then they may say, well, that is that's something that we can't implement. Had he not mentioned that, had he not put it, let's say he put it in his VPAT, then when I, as a user who wants to adopt that particular module, when I have to go through an exception process, probably, to bring the software on campus, because there'll be a flaw, maybe a minor one. So if I have to go through an exception process, I have something to put in there that the university can evaluate. And also because Mark suggested that, I hope it's Mark, I think I got it right. Because he suggested that, if I'm implementing your software, I can add it to my budget, right? So you gave me information at the beginning that then I can then take and then I can act appropriately. That was a great question, Catherine. Ask another one.
Yeah, that was from the Botanical Society of America, and she says thank you. I'm not sure which of the Botanical Society of America people it's, because I know there was two on the call, but I don't know who this one was. But
upfront planning. Upfront planning is when you do your budget. You know, if we were to go back to my presentation all the way back to the beginning, you know, and we said grants, and I showed you the picture of Cary Grant. When you did that grant, put in the cost, you know, and then I'll be honest with you that I have worked on grants where accessibility was part of it. I worked on grants that accessibility is not part of it, and I never got pushback on additional cost related to the accessibility portion. As a matter of fact, it made our grant, I think, more attractive to those, both in the federal government and in the private sector grants. I think our response was more attractive because we actually showed that we were being inclusive and mindful of the population.
That's really cool. So I want to make a pitch just for the fact that you also talked about this in terms of like some examples of how this might be implemented, or where you would see this as part of the Gateways 2020 conference presentations. And that is now already archived on our YouTube website. So if people wanted to hear more about accessibility and also how it relates to usability in terms of some basic principles, we have that up there. And I'm going to make sure too that the handout that you provided for that session is readily accessible, because that is also useful.
That one was much more technically oriented, and so I tried to avoid, you know, really getting too far down in the weeds. And that one is definitely weeds level.
Yeah, well, and then and plus there was your learning lab, and I don't know whether
that was really weeds level.
Yeah, I think I recorded it, but I don't know if it's available. I haven't looked at it yet. So, but your keynote is there, and there's a handout that's really helpful. So I think I would encourage folks to have a look at that as well. But yeah, I think, well, we're almost out of time. So what I'll do is say thank you, Hiram, again for stepping in to tell people about accessibility twice in less than a month. So I appreciate it. This has been really interesting, and it's you know, it's both daunting and though at the same time I think you know, provides a little bit of hopefulness, because if you know ahead of time, it's you know, or I mean, I think that will be the biggest challenge for folks.
Well, it is coming. It is coming. I mean, so the COVID has really thrown it in our face, and then, you know, I don't need to rehash the presentation, but you know, you know, the accessibility is being looked at by universities in a way that it hadn't been previously.
Yeah. So anyway, so thank you, Hiram. And I just want to encourage folks to check in with us next month. We will be having a special 90-minute webinar that is going to be one of the Focus Week sessions. So you can step in for that, just for a little sampler. And that will be at our usual time, but just a little longer. And I also encourage you to give us feedback using that link that I put in chat, about 5 or 6 posts up. As well as you can see it and type it in from what's on the screen here. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, everyone. And as you saw, Hiram provided his email on his final slide, so you could certainly email him and bug him, and he's very friendly, as you can tell. So I'm sure he'd be happy to help.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next month.